There are not enough words capable of describing the importance of the people who raise us in our lives, whether they are fathers, mothers, other family members, guardians. These people are responsible for introducing us to the world, educating us, and preparing us for adult life. Today's case deals with a dark side to this, when that person who should be caring for their loved ones thinks more about themselves than the person they should be caring for. This is the story of Lacey Spears, a mother who neglected her son's health with the sole intention of getting attention. Lacey Spears was born on October 16, 1987, in Alabama, United States. Lacey lived with her parents, Terry and Daniel Spears, and was the youngest daughter of the couple, who also had a boy and another girl. Lacey has always lived with people with poor health, as her mother suffered from type 1 diabetes and her father suffered from Crohn's disease, a disease that causes inflammation in the gastrointestinal system. The relationship with her parents was far from ideal. It was turbulent, full of fights and arguments. As a child, Lacey had a distant relationship with her mother, as Terry was described as a cold person who did not show affection. Perhaps this was the reason for her obsession with dolls. During her elementary school years, Lacey was always carrying and playing with at least one of her dolls, and her play always involved her acting as a mother. She said that one day she would be a real mother and displayed extremely protective behavior. In an episode where a friend went to Lacey's house to play, the girl took one of the dolls without permission, which caused her to attack her friend and clasp her hands around her neck. As time passed and Lacey grew older, she began to abandon her obsession with dolls. When she started high school, the young woman was considered an excellent student who had good grades and was very participative in class. But for many of her classmates, Lacey was also seen as a teacher's pet, always doing everything she could to please them. Her school friends reported several unbelievable stories that Lacey had told them, stories that involved abuse, anorexia, and even an unwanted pregnancy. Also that people would feel sorry for her and thus pay attention to her. Whenever one of these stories was thought to be untrue, or when she didn't receive the sympathy and attention she desired, she would alter the lie to something different, or even worse, until she got what she wanted. Even as a teenager, she always made her desire to take care of children and be a mother known. This desire led Lacey to look for work in this area of children, as a babysitter, assistant in daycare centers, or primary schools, something she ended up finding easily. While still studying, Lacey worked in the local church nursery, but it wasn't long before she began to behave strangely towards the children, acting as if she was their real mother. This behavior and some of the lies she told started to bother her parents, which ended up resulting in a meeting with the pastor. None of the adults wanted her to remain in the nursery any longer. However, after a meeting with her parents, the pastor cancelled the intervention and Lacey remained working. In 2005, shortly after graduating high school, now 18, Lacey moved out of her parents' house with her sister and into the Cedar Key apartment homes complex. In this new phase, she worked during the day at another daycare center, and on some nights, she worked as a nanny, sometimes even offering the service for free. Among the children she cared for was a 10-month-old boy named Cameron Clark. Everywhere they went together, Lacey acted as if she were his mother. She spent many hours beyond the stipulated time with the boy and even told some strangers that Cameron was in fact her son. Despite being under Lacey's continuous care, Cameron had constant ear infections which, with the use of medication to treat, were cured, but soon returned. After a few months, Christy Burnham, Lacey's friend and Cameron's mother, began to find this obsessive behaviour with the boy strange and became very upset when she found out that Lacy was saying that Cameron was her son. However, their relationship only really broke down when Lacy was called to stay with the boy for 2 days in a row due to Christy's work trip. But during that time, Lacy didn't answer any calls. When Christy returned, very worried, she saw that the boy was fine, but the explanation given for not having answered any calls was not at all convincing, which led Christy to permanently cut ties with Lacy. The young woman then began to care for another boy named Jonathan Strain, aged 6 months. It wasn't long before the same problems that occurred with Cameron began to happen with Jonathan, such as obsessive behaviour with the child and ear infections that appeared out of nowhere. Furthermore, after a while, Autumn Hunt, Jonathan's mother, discovered that Lacy was posting photos on the social network MySpace with her son, as if she were his real mother. Autumn immediately confronted her about the posts. Lacy explained that it was because of her love for the boy, apologised, and said she would delete the photos. Despite this incident, Autumn allowed Lacy to continue caring for her son. Until that point, Lacy's strange behaviour involved with other people's children. But things would get even more bizarre when Lacy decided that the time had come for her to have her own child. In 2007, when Lacy was around 20 years old, she started seeing a man named Blake Robinson, a police officer. They had a few dates, but nothing came of it. The next relationship was in 2008 with her neighbour Chris Hill, who worked as a gate installer. Chris lived in the apartment below where Lacy lived with her sister, and one day she came down to his apartment to ask him to install a children's bed for Jonathan, who still stayed with her some weekends. They started talking, and from these conversations a neighbours with benefits relationship emerged. That is, a relationship which is casual and mainly sexual in nature. Sometime later, Lacy discovered she was pregnant. Chris was very happy with the news and even proposed a marriage so that they could form a family and provide the best possible care for the child. They even looked at baby names and discussed what the wedding would be like. However, Lacy had a sudden change in behaviour towards Chris, distancing herself and saying that the son was not his. She even threatened to call the police if he tried to approach her and the boy. Thus, the two separated, and from that moment on, Chris would never be able to see his son again. Lacey, now 21, gave birth to Garnet Paul Thompson Spears on December 5, 2008. He was born with no apparent health problems, and from the first minute she was at her son's side in the hospital, Lacy recorded and shared photos on her social networks. She began to receive a lot of attention and sympathy, with many people liking, commenting and sending messages congratulating her. Despite being born healthy, Garnet returned to the hospital at only 9 days old. According to Lacy, he had a fever and something was wrong with his ear. Doctors ran a series of tests to try to figure out what was going on, but they didn't see anything wrong with the baby. Garnet was discharged and returned home. The weeks went by. Lacy posted photos with her son practically every day, and of course she received several likes, messages, and was simply loving all the attention she received. A little after Christmas, Lacy took Garnet to the hospital again, stating that he was sick and that she didn't know what to do. Doctors carried out new tests and were unable to identify anything. As a precaution, doctors administered medication through intravenous injections. For Lacy, this was the perfect opportunity for her to photograph her son and post the photos on social media attracting more compassion and attention. From that moment on, visits to doctors and hospitals became frequent. She always claimed that her sons suffered from different things, such as seizures, ear infections, high fever, and intestinal problems. Doctors performed tests and found nothing. Garnet remained a healthy child, and during all consultations, Lacy was there taking photos and posting them on social media. After several consultations, the doctors began to find it strange that they were never able to identify any of the symptoms mentioned by the mother. Suspicions would then turn to Lacy's health, more specifically, that it could be a case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Here it is worth opening a small summary to explain what Munchausen syndrome by proxy is. Identified for the first time in 1977 by British paediatrician Roy Meadow, this syndrome by proxy is a variation of the traditional Munchausen syndrome, where the patient simulates symptoms of illness in order to receive attention and treatment. In this variation, the person responsible for the patient simulates, or in more serious cases, causes symptoms in the patient so that they also receive attention. It is a very worrying syndrome, as it can occur in serious cases of child abuse, where the child is subjected to unnecessary medical treatments that can harm their physical and psychological health. Whenever Lacy was confronted by one of the doctors who carefully tried to talk to her, informing her that perhaps it was she who might be sick instead of her son, she reacted very aggressively and did not return for appointments with that doctor, taking the boy to another paediatrician. When Garnet was almost 8 months old, he was admitted to the hospital once again. Lacy claimed he wasn't eating and was losing a lot of weight. After carrying out tests, they realized that there was nothing wrong with him. However, Lacy was desperate because the boy was not eating anything, and at her request, an external feeding tube was surgically inserted to facilitate the boy's food intake. In the year 2011, Lacy also created a blog called Garnet's Journey to document the life of her son, who was now 2 years old. There she reported various aspects of her son's life, from hospitalizations and medical appointments to trips and outings they took as a family. However, what draws the most attention is that in this blog, there's a mention of Garnet's father. The blog did not talk about the boy's real father, but rather about a character created by Lacy called Blake, a police officer who was engaged to Lacy, who had died recently. In the second half of 2012, Garnet, now almost 4 years old, was ready to go to school, and it was at that moment that she heard about the Brotherhood. This community focused on elderly care and community services, and in exchange for these services, the people who worked there received housing, food and education for their children. The community had a self-sustainable system. Lacy was enchanted by the more organic and natural lifestyle and decided to move with Garnet, as it would be the ideal lifestyle to cure all the problems her son had. The site was a 24-hectare farm. The two adapted very well to the place. Garnet soon made several friends and was very happy in his new home. But something caught the attention of community residents. From what Lacy posted on social media, Garnet was a very sick boy and had difficulty eating. However, when they saw the boy, they saw a child full of health and vigour, and who had no difficulty eating. Quite the opposite, in fact. Once, one of the families took the children to eat at a restaurant close to the community, and Garnet, in addition to eating everything, asked to go again. The stories Lacy told began to be questioned by neighbours. They even began to discreetly ask more details about the boy's father. And even though Garnet was eating well and living what was perhaps the best period of his life, Lacy occasionally took him to the doctor and had the boy fed through tubes. So, it was in this place that Lacy hoped to find the ideal life for her sick son. However, she had no idea this would be the beginning of her darkest secrets being uncovered. In January 2014, just a year after they moved to the Brotherhood, Lacy called a friend from the community, Valerie, saying that she really needed her help as Garnet was having seizures and she didn't have a car to take her son to the hospital. The friend ran to her house, but when she got there, she saw Lacy calmly packing a suitcase, something that she found strange due to the urgency that had been conveyed in the call. Another thing this friend noticed was that Garnet had his feeding tube connected to a bag with a whitish liquid, similar in appearance to milk, but a little lighter. Lacy said she still needed to feed him breast milk, and that's what was in there. Everyone got into the car and went to the hospital. Garnet had already returned from there a few days previously, after developing a fever and headaches, but he had recovered after just a few hours of observation. Therefore, the doctors were surprised to see him again so soon, this time with convulsions, and decided to hospitalize the boy. Tests were carried out, and everything seemed normal, including the sodium content in his body, which was 134 milliequivalents per litre. During the first day he spent in the hospital, there were no seizures. The next day, Garnet woke up with severe stomach pain, nausea, and difficulty breathing. When they performed tests, doctors noticed something unusual. His sodium levels had jumped from 134 to 182 milliequivalents per litre, an amount much higher than normal and which can be fatal. The doctors did their best to stabilise Garnet, but they were unable to do so, and the boy had to be transferred to a specialised hospital. Garnet was transported by helicopter to Maria Ferreri Children's Hospital in Winchester, where doctors had already been informed of the situation and were on standby. There, doctors managed to normalise his sodium levels. Garnet and Lacy were taken to a room with a camera used to monitor patients. For the next 2 days, Garnet was recovering, while she continued to post photos of her son on social media, asking for strength and prayers. On the morning of the 3rd day, the nurse went to the room and reported that Garnet had improved greatly and would probably be discharged later that day. Lacy was beaming with happiness, but according to camera footage, when the nurse left the room, Lacy took Garnet to the bathroom, along with one of the bags with the white liquid. A short time later, Garnet began to feel very unwell again. He complained that his head was hurting, and he was very unwell. Doctors rushed to help and noticed that his sodium levels were again much higher than normal. The boy became extremely sick, and doctors were forced to put him on a life support machine. And what was his mother's first reaction? To take photos and post on social media. Doctors couldn't believe the sudden increase in sodium levels. That would have been impossible to occur if it had not been induced. And the only person who remained with Garnet all this time was his mother. At that moment, Lacy becomes the only suspect for her son's deterioration, and the police are called. 2 police teams worked to investigate the case. One of them went to Lacy's house to see if there was evidence that she was poisoning her son, while the other continued the investigation at the hospital. During her interrogation at the hospital, her father, Daniel, arrived. One of the police officers discussed the whole situation with him in relation to the reason why they were there, and expressed his condolences for the loss of the boy's father. Daniel finds this speech strange, stating that the boy's father was alive and his name was not Blake, but rather Chris Hill, who even wanted to have participated in Garnet's life, but was forbidden by her. He pointed out that the Blake that Lacy says was the boy's father was the police officer she dated a few times, and that he was also alive. At Lacy's home, police found all of the medications she administered to her son. However, next to the medication, they found an open can of salt. And things only got worse for her when, of her own free will, her friend Valerie showed up to give a statement. Valerie said that when Garnet was admitted, Lacy had called her and asked her to discard the bags of white liquid, without explaining why. Finding the request strange, Valerie kept one of the bags in her house and then handed it over to the police. The officers collected the material and sent it to the laboratory. Unfortunately, in the midst of the investigation, the worst thing happened. On January 23, 2014, 2 days after being placed on life support, Garnet passed away. Analysis of the white liquid revealed that it was in fact a solution with the amount of sodium equivalent to 69 sachets of salt, enough to cause swelling, loss of basic body functions, and possibly ear infections. So, the police had discovered how Lacy caused the sodium level in the boy's body to rise, but they still needed more concrete evidence to incriminate her. And this evidence came through recordings on the hospital room camera. That same year, 2014, Lacy was arrested on murder charges. The trial began on March 2nd, 2015. Although several doctors and specialists pointed to Lacy as a possible case of Munchausen by proxy, she never actually had this diagnosis, and her defense chose to defend her as innocent, stating that the hospital was truly responsible for her son's death. However, the evidence and the fact that Lacy visited more than 10 different doctors left no doubts for the jury, who found her guilty of manslaughter when there is no intention to kill. On April 8th, the judge sentenced her to 20 years in prison without the right to parole, 5 years less than the maximum sentence. Since then, Lacy has been in prison serving her sentence. The program 48 Hours from CBS News did a story about the case and interviewed Lacy from inside the prison. She claims in this interview that she is innocent and that she never gave her child anything other than normal. She also says that in prison, the other inmates call her a murder and that her food is always served by the prison chef with lots of salt. If you've made it this far, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to this channel. Also, add your opinion in our comments. Thank you very much. I will see you in the next case.